It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a room filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and smiles. But in one chilling moment, everything changed. Secrets long hidden began to surface, and a marriage that seemed unbreakable was about to shatter. Stay with us as we unravel the story of betrayal, resilience, and the unforgettable night when a wife finally said, "Enough." The evening was alive with excitement as friends and family gathered to honor Robert on his 70th birthday. The dining room was a picture of joy. Golden balloons hovered near the ceiling, casting a soft glow, while the crisp clink of champagne glasses filled the air. Each guest had come to celebrate Robert, a man admired as a devoted friend, a beloved family member, and a mentor to many. To everyone, he seemed to have it all, especially the unwavering love and support of his wife, Linda. Linda, known for her quiet elegance and kindness, stood slightly apart from the crowd, observing the scene with a calm smile. She held her glass delicately, her gaze sweeping over each joyful face before resting on Robert. Beneath her composed expression, however, was a flicker of something more, a sense of anticipation, as though she knew this night would mark a turning point. Linda's gaze finally settled on Robert, who stood laughing, his arm slightly angled toward a younger woman at his side. The woman was Sarah, Robert's nurse, hired to assist him through recent health issues. Sarah was vibrant, beautiful, and perhaps a touch too close to her patient. Linda's lips curved into a polite smile, but for anyone observing closely, a subtle tension was visible in her posture, a slight clench of her fingers around the glass. Months of suspicion had been building toward this night. Linda had silently observed the lingering glances, the conversations that grew hushed whenever she entered the room. She had been watching, quietly collecting pieces of evidence. And though she had never confronted Robert, tonight she was done playing the supportive, quiet wife. Tonight she would finally reveal her truth. As the clock struck, Linda's fingers tightened around her glass, and with a steady hand, she tapped it with a silver spoon. The clear, resonant sound cut through the noise like a blade, bringing all conversation to a sudden halt. One by one, heads turned, and every eye in the room shifted toward her. Robert, his laughter fading, looked over with a smile that faltered slightly, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Thank you, everyone," Linda began, her voice calm and unwavering. "It's wonderful to see all of you here for this special night. Robert, you're fortunate to be surrounded by so many friends and family who love you." She paused, letting her gaze slowly travel across the room, her tone warm and gracious, yet her eyes were sharp, locked onto her husband. Robert's hand hovered over his glass, his glance shifting uncertainly to Sarah beside him. Linda lifted her glass a bit higher, ensuring every gaze returned to her. Linda raised her glass, her voice steady and unyielding. "To my dear husband," she began, 70 years filled with love, dedication, and a lifetime of memories. She paused, letting her words settle over the room, then turned her gaze directly to Sarah. "And of course," she added, her tone taking on a sharp, unmistakable chill, "to Sarah, who has been much more than just Robert's nurse." A wave of stunned silence swept across the room. Glasses froze midair, and a ripple of murmurs began among the guests. Robert's face drained of color, his mouth slightly agape in shock, while Sarah's eyes darted nervously between him and Linda, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. The once cheerful gathering was now charged with tension as guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what they had just heard. Linda's smile remained, though her gaze stayed firmly on Robert, a calm intensity flashing in her eyes. "Yes, Sarah," she continued, her voice still smooth but now edged with a fierce clarity. "Thank you for everything you've done for Robert. It's rare to find someone who cares as deeply as you do." Her words, though outwardly polite, carried a sharp undertone that kept everyone on edge, hanging on to every syllable, waiting to see what would unfold next. Robert cleared his throat, visibly shaken, as he struggled to regain his composure. His hands trembled slightly. "Linda," he began softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What, what are you saying?" "Oh, I think you know, Robert," Linda replied, her tone as smooth as ever, but her gaze now piercing, unwavering. "Or perhaps Sarah can help you recall all those late nights, those quiet conversations, She let her words trail off, allowing the weight of her accusation to settle over the room. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. A few guests glanced down uncomfortably. Some looked toward the door as if planning a quiet exit, while others stood transfixed, unable to tear their eyes away from the drama unfolding before them. Linda glanced around, savoring the moment, before turning her piercing gaze back to Robert and his nurse, both now visibly uneasy. "To my husband," she continued, raising her glass once more, "who has shared a life with me, and apparently much more with Sarah here." Her voice dropped, the warmth now completely gone, replaced by a chilling edge. "A toast," she said softly, her words loaded with unspoken accusations. "To 70 years, and every secret yet to be uncovered." Robert's face reddened as he opened his mouth to respond, but the words failed him. Beside him, Sarah, looking pale and shaken, took a step back, her hand trembling as she set her glass on the table. The silence deepened, punctuated only by a few nervous coughs from around the room, but no one dared to break the spell Linda had cast. She watched them both, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips, satisfaction flickering in her eyes. "Tonight," she continued in a quiet but intense tone, "we'll see just how many secrets stay hidden, or if some may come to light." In that moment, everyone felt the unmistakable chill in the air. What had been a joyful birthday celebration had transformed into something darker, and Linda was only getting started. Her words lingered in the air, hanging like a storm cloud over the room. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting nervously between Linda and Sarah, struggling to maintain his composure. The shock of Linda's words had struck him harder than he could hide. Linda kept her eyes locked on him, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every guest leaned in, straining to catch her words. "I know, Robert," she said softly, her voice intended only for him, though it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've known for a while. All those late nights, the mysterious appointments. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Sarah's face turned ashen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She glanced toward the door, as if considering a swift escape, but she remained rooted to the spot, clearly caught off guard by Linda's unexpected revelation. Robert forced a strained smile, attempting to laugh off Linda's words. "Linda, please," he murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's not make a scene." Robert's voice trembled, barely masking the note of panic. "Linda, please, let's not make a scene." But Linda simply raised an eyebrow, her calm, icy expression unwavering. "A scene?" she echoed, her tone steady but edged with a chilling finality. "Oh, I think we're well past keeping up appearances, don't you?" She turned to face the guests, who stood in the stunned silence, some whispering among themselves, others visibly uncomfortable. "You all came here tonight to celebrate Robert," she began, her voice rising with conviction. "The man you admire, the friend you rely on. But maybe there's more to him than you realize." Linda allowed her words to settle, the silence amplifying the tension. Then slowly she turned back to Sarah, her gaze narrowing. "And you, Sarah. You've been more than just a nurse, haven't you? The late-night care sessions, the private calls. I'm sure you thought I wouldn't notice." Sarah's lips parted, and she stammered, "Linda, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Her voice wavered, but Linda's intense stare silenced her instantly. "No, Sarah," Linda replied, her voice icy and unyielding. "I understand perfectly." Her gaze drifted back to Robert, who was now visibly sweating, his usually confident composure unraveling beneath his wife's accusations. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, one coughing awkwardly. No one dared to speak, yet no one could look away. They were witnessing a scene that had transformed the joyful evening into something raw and deeply unsettling. Linda took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her eyes sweeping over the room, taking in the shocked, curious, and uncomfortable faces around her. "I apologize for making you all a part of this," she said, her tone laced with irony. "But I thought it was only fair to share a little honesty for a change." Robert finally found his voice, his tone pleading as he extended a hand toward her. "Linda, please, this isn't the time or the place. Can we talk about this privately?" His voice cracked, betraying his desperation. Linda's gaze hardened. Oh, I think you've done quite enough talking behind closed doors, Robert, she replied, her voice razor sharp. Now it's time for honesty, out here, for everyone to see. Each word struck him with the force of every buried suspicion and unspoken hurt she had held back for so long. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with the weight of anticipation. What had begun as a cheerful celebration had become an unfiltered display of raw emotion and exposed truths, leaving every guest captivated, yet deeply unsettled. Secrets hung heavily in the air as Linda continued to hold Robert's gaze. It was clear this was only the beginning of what she intended to reveal. The room was thick with tension, every eye locked onto the three figures at the center of this unfolding drama. Moments ago, guests had been laughing, clinking glasses. Now they watched, captivated and tense, as Linda took a deliberate step closer to Robert, her eyes piercing him with a look that made him seem small and exposed before everyone. I stood by you, Robert, she began, her voice low but filled with an intensity that silenced the room. Through everything, every challenge, every triumph. I believed in you, trusted you. And how did you repay that trust? Robert opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. He glanced at Sarah, who stood rigid, her eyes cast down, as though wishing she could vanish from this nightmare. Did you think I was blind? Linda continued, her voice steady and controlled, though her eyes burned with anger. Did you think I wouldn't see the changes, the secrets, the way you both acted around each other? Her gaze swept over the guests, drawing them into her story, as though each person needed to understand the weight of her betrayal. Mark, one of Robert's close friends, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if he might intervene. But a quick, cutting glance from Linda held him in place, and no one dared to interrupt. She turned back to Robert, her expression a mix of hurt and unshakable resolve. For months I watched, she said softly, each word carrying a weight that pressed down on everyone present. I watched as you snuck around, made excuse after excuse. And you know what, Robert? I even gave you a chance to come clean. I waited, hoping you'd find the courage to be honest. Her words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if Robert might respond, might finally confess. But instead he stood there, his face a mask of guilt and shame. Linda's expression hardened. Nothing? She asked, her voice edged with disbelief. Not even an apology? Robert's voice finally broke through, trembling as he whispered. Linda, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. He took a hesitant step toward her, hands outstretched in a plea for forgiveness. But Linda held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. Don't, she said sharply, her tone as cold as ice, cutting him deeper than any words could. You've already done enough. She looked at him then, as though seeing him for the first time, a man she once loved, now a stranger wrapped in lies. Around them, guests exchanged whispers, some in stunned silence, others darting their gaze between Linda, Robert, and Sarah. They couldn't have imagined that Robert, a man they respected and admired, could be capable of such betrayal. And as the weight of his actions settled over them, they felt a mix of shock, disappointment, and a strange sense of curiosity. What would Linda do next? Linda took a slow, steadying breath before she spoke again. This isn't just about an affair, Robert, she said, her voice low yet resolute. It's about the choices you made, the lies you told. You thought you could have everything? A devoted wife at home, a nurse to keep you company? But tonight, I'm putting an end to your charade. Robert's face was pale, his hands trembling as he grasped the depth of Linda's resolve. His gaze shifted around the room, searching for a friendly face, a sign of support. But he found only blank, silent stares, each person's judgment quietly condemning him. Pulling further away, Sarah, still standing nearby, looked as though she might faint. She glanced at Robert, her expression full of worry and regret, but he couldn't meet her eyes. He knew that everyone he cared about now saw the truth, and there was no going back. Linda raised her glass one final time, her voice strong and unwavering. To the truth, she declared, her gaze locked on Robert, and to the consequences that follow it. May they be as unforgettable as this night. Robert finally found his voice, his tone pleading as he extended a hand toward her. Linda, please. This isn't the time or the place. Can we talk about this privately? His voice cracked, betraying his desperation. Linda's gaze hardened. Oh, I think you've done quite enough talking behind closed doors, Robert, she replied, her voice razor sharp. Now it's time for honesty. Out here, for everyone to see. Each word struck him with the force of every buried suspicion and unspoken hurt she had held back for so long. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with the weight of anticipation. What had begun as a cheerful celebration had become an unfiltered display of raw emotion and exposed truths, leaving every guest captivated, yet deeply unsettled. Secrets hung heavily in the air as Linda continued to hold Robert's gaze. It was clear this was only the beginning of what she intended to reveal. The room was thick with tension, every eye locked onto the three figures at the center of this unfolding drama. Moments ago, guests had been laughing, clinking glasses. Now they watched, captivated and tense, as Linda took a deliberate step closer to Robert, her eyes piercing him with a look that made him seem small and exposed before everyone. I stood by you, Robert, she began, her voice low but filled with an intensity that silenced the room. Through everything, every challenge, every triumph, I believed in you, trusted you. And how did you repay that trust? Robert opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. He glanced at Sarah, who stood rigid, her eyes cast down, as though wishing she could vanish from this nightmare. Did you think I was blind? Linda continued, her voice steady and controlled, though her eyes burned with anger. Did you think I wouldn't see the changes, the secrets, the way you both acted around each other? Her gaze swept over the guests, drawing them into her story, as though each person needed to understand the weight of her betrayal. Mark, one of Robert's close friends, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if he might intervene. But a quick, cutting glance from Linda held him in place, and no one dared to interrupt. She turned back to Robert, her expression a mix of hurt and unshakable resolve. For months I watched, she said softly, each word carrying a weight that pressed down on everyone present. I watched as you snuck around, made excuse after excuse. And you know what, Robert? I even gave you a chance to come clean. I waited, hoping you'd find the courage to be honest. Her words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if Robert might respond, might finally confess. But instead, he stood there, his face a mask of guilt and shame. Linda's expression hardened. Nothing? She asked, her voice edged with disbelief. Not even an apology? Robert's voice finally broke through, trembling as he whispered, Linda, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. He took a hesitant step toward her, hands outstretched in a plea for forgiveness. The room was silent, each person frozen as Linda's words sank in. They knew that nothing about this night or their relationships with Robert would ever be the same. The silence was suffocating, with every guest caught between shock and disbelief. Linda lowered her glass, her gaze still fixed on Robert, who now looked as if he wished he could vanish. Beside him, Sarah clutched her purse, her face pale, hands trembling. She seemed to be grasping for words, desperate for a way out of this nightmare, but Linda wasn't about to let her escape so easily. Sarah, Linda said, her voice sharp and controlled, you're not leaving just yet. You've been so close to Robert all these months. Why not stay a little longer and explain exactly what your services involved? Sarah's face flushed, and she stammered, Linda, please. It's not what you think. Linda raised an eyebrow, a trace of amusement in her eyes. Oh? Then why don't you enlighten us? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like betrayal from both of you. Robert stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda, enough. This is between us. You don't need to drag Sarah into this. But Linda's eyes flashed with anger. Don't you dare defend her, she retorted, her voice seething. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was there for you, wasn't she? There to comfort you, to spend those long, quiet nights with you? While I waited at home. She turned to the crowd, her voice rising, addressing each guest who had come to celebrate her husband's birthday, only to witness his disgrace. I welcomed Sarah into our lives. into our home. She was supposed to help him, to care for him when he needed it. But it seems she was more interested in getting close to him, closer than any nurse should. Linda's words hovered in the air, sending an uneasy ripple through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, while others whispered in hushed voices, struggling to process the accusations she had so fearlessly laid bare. It was evident she had carried this knowledge for a long time, that each word she spoke had been simmering within her, waiting for this very moment. Sarah's shoulders slumped and she looked down, her guilt etched across her face. "Linda," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Linda remained unmoved, her voice hard with bitterness. "Sorry? You're sorry now?" she echoed, her tone thick with resentment. "After all the lies? After all the betrayal? You knew he was married, Sarah. You knew exactly what you were doing." Robert reached for Linda's hand. Desperation etched in his eyes, but she pulled away, her gaze cold and resolute. "Please, Linda," Robert pleaded, his voice trembling. "Let's go somewhere private and talk. This, this isn't the place." But Linda pulled her hand away, her gaze cold and resolute. "No, Robert," she replied firmly. "This is exactly the place. I've spent months staying silent, pretending I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. But tonight, everyone will know the truth." The guests looked on in stunned silence as Linda stepped away from her husband and his nurse, her words echoing in the tense stillness of the room. She had made her stand, and nothing would be the same. Robert looked utterly defeated, his face drained of color, his shoulders slumped, as if finally realizing the full weight of his actions. Sarah, too, seemed to shrink under Linda's unyielding gaze, her earlier confidence now shattered. Linda took a steadying breath, her expression softening just slightly as she spoke again, her voice quieter but no less intense. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Robert?" she asked, a trace of pain flickering across her face. "Do you know how many nights I lay awake, wondering what was happening? How it felt to look at you and see a stranger in the man I married?" Robert looked at her, regret etched into every line of his face, but he remained silent. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the depth of the hurt he had caused. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to apologize, but no words came. What could he say to undo the pain he had inflicted? Linda shook her head as though dismissing any notion of forgiveness. "You took everything we built together," she continued, her voice trembling. "All those years, all those memories, and you threw them away. For her." A few guests, unable to handle the intensity of the moment, quietly made their way toward the door, offering polite nods and murmured goodbyes. But most stayed, transfixed by the raw honesty of the scene unfolding before them, unable to look away from the wreckage of a life exposed. Finally, Robert found his voice, his tone pleading. "Linda, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. I made a mistake. But please, can't we just put this behind us?" Linda's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Put it behind us? You really think it's that simple?" She let out a bitter laugh that sliced through the silence. "You betrayed me, Robert. You betrayed everything we had." She took a step back, as though distancing herself from the man who had once been her partner, her friend, her love. "There's no going back from this," she said softly, her voice filled with finality. "Tonight isn't just about your birthday, it's about showing you what it feels like to be exposed, to be left with nothing." Robert's face fell, and he reached for her one last time, desperation clear in his eyes. But Linda only shook her head, her expression resolute. She was done. The life they had built together was over, and nothing could undo the damage that had been done. Linda stood in the center of the room, surrounded by guests who had come to celebrate her husband's life. Now they bore witness to the end of their marriage, to the collapse of the world she had known. She looked around, meeting each gaze, seeing in their eyes a mix of sympathy, shock, and, in some, admiration. She had taken back control, had stood up for herself in the face of betrayal. And in that moment, a calm she hadn't expected washed over her. With one final look at Robert, she took a deep breath, her voice steady but unyielding. "You made your choice, Robert. Tonight I've made mine." She set her champagne glass down with a steady hand. then turned and walked toward the door. As Linda walked through the crowd, heads turned, guests stepping back respectfully to let her pass. Robert remained rooted in place, his face a mixture of despair and disbelief, watching as the woman he had taken for granted left him behind. When Linda reached the door, she paused, casting one last look over her shoulder. "Goodbye, Robert," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "May you remember this night as the moment you lost everything?" And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving Robert, his nurse, and the shattered remnants of their relationship behind. The room was silent as the guests watched her go, as if witnessing the closing scene of a story that would be whispered about for years to come. Robert slumped back, his head falling into his hands as the full weight of his loss finally settled upon him. Linda was gone, and he knew there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. As the last of the guests made their way out, each one offered Robert a look of quiet disappointment or sympathy. Eventually, he was left alone in the empty house, the echoes of the evening's events reverberating through the silence. If this story of betrayal and resilience moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable true stories that reveal the highs and lows of human relationships. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. This story reminds us that trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, repairing it can be nearly impossible. Betrayal often doesn't just end a relationship, it transforms it, revealing truths we may not want to face. But there's strength in standing up for oneself, as Linda did, and choosing honesty over silent suffering. It's a powerful lesson in knowing when to let go and value your own worth, even when it's painful.